All right. Well, I guess it's after 7 o'clock. Hi, everybody. I'm your host, Ron. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the president of KYJSUG Software here in town, local consultancy that focuses on web apps and web applications and mobile applications. Actually, most of our work recently has been on horse betting applications, so that's kind of fun. A very Lexington thing, I like to think. This is the regular meeting of the Kentucky JavaScript user group, and which is typically the third Thursday of the month. And this month we have Chris Wininger who giving a talk on NestJS. Which he tells me is a very Ruby-like framework for NodeJS. So, Chris, without further ado, welcome, and why don't you tell us about what you're up to?
Hello. Yeah, so quick introduction, I guess, for those who don't already know me. I think quite a few people on here do, but my name's Chris. I'm a senior software engineer at Sonatype. Standard disclaimer, my views do not represent Sonatypes. I'm just here to chat and express my own opinions. Been writing software professionally for like 12 plus years and writing software in some capacity for longer than I can remember or care to count. Yeah, I just wanted to I'd been checking out NestJS, more my capacity. I do some work for Infinite Industries, which some people here locally might be aware of. We're a nonprofit that promotes local art and cultural events. We have a we have a web API that's written, with Express, NodeJS. It's getting a little gnarly and hard to wrangle. So I started looking at this as a possible replacement. And I wanted to kind of take this talk as an opportunity to kind of give my first impressions and hopefully kind of give some people that may be a little newer to this some idea of what you might want to look for in a framework and how you might want to think about selecting a framework, and just kind of talk about what I learned there, and I'll show some sample code. So without further ado, as I was saying, this talk's going to be about building web APIs using NestJS. It's not going to be like some sort of expert, in-depth, down on the weeds discussion of NestJS. So if you're here for that, I'm sorry. It's going to be more of a kind of first impressions, high-level talk, and some sample code showing what an application built with NestJS could look like. So again, sticking to that high level, first off, what is NestJS if you've never seen it? Straight from the horse's mouth, it is a progressive NodeJS framework for building efficient, reliable, and scalable server-side applications. Boiling that down a bit and kind of summarizing from some of the stuff in their documentation, they take a lot of inspiration from Angular, which is a front-end framework you might be aware of. Specifically, I should say Angular 2+, not old school Angular. As Ron mentioned, though, I'd say if you're familiar with other web APIs like Rails or SpringBoot or DropWizard, stuff here will also look familiar from that angle as well. It may be, in fact, that most of their inspiration comes from Angular, but Angular wasn't developed in a vacuum, and everybody steals from everybody. So you'll see a lot of stuff that's familiar if you're either familiar with Angular or any other web frameworks. One of the things I really liked about this one and that made me want to check it out was that it supports TypeScript as a first-class citizen. It has a dependency injection system. It provides an API that's built around the TypeScript decorators, and it offers opinions on how to organize the server side of your JavaScript project, which is something that I feel is a little lacking out there. Node.js tends towards the Wild West, and there's so many, it's so open-ended how you can organize things. It's kind of refreshing to see a project that tries to nudge you in the right direction there. Also, another thing I learned is despite calling themselves Nest, their site seems to feature not so much pictures of birds as cats. So I'm not so sure. Yeah. Maybe this is like the suburbs that name themselves after the thing they destroyed when they were being built. Like, I don't know.
My cat would like.
Yeah. So first off, framework versus library, just for anybody out there that may not be as familiar with these terms or that might be a little bit confused, just briefly talk about what the difference is there. For me, the distinction largely boils down to who's calling who. With a library, it's something that you're going to pull into your project as a dependency, and you're going to invoke functions on that library, and it'll do stuff for you. So you're going to import, say jQuery, and you're going to say jQuery dot whatever you do with jQuery these days, get document, find element. A framework, though, a framework calls you. With a framework, you're going to have like some project, some piece of code that you download, and often you're going to see a common pattern with frameworks is it's going to have sort of skeleton for you. Like it may have a generator or something that you can use to create a new project. There'll often be a skeleton, and then you put code in the appropriate places in that skeleton, and you start the framework. The framework is basically providing the entry point to your application, and then you're filling in the details. It's calling your code. So in NestJS framework, framework call you, hence the joke there. And you don't always necessarily have to have that skeleton provided, by the way. It's worth saying, like you could have a framework that's maybe skip some of that where it might just be the form of here's what the project looks like. You might have to put some of that glue together yourself. So that's one of the things I'll talk about that I look for in a framework is ideally it does provide that for you. So what makes you want to use a framework in the first place? I think a lot of people, well, I don't know about a lot of people, but I have heard the opinion that the learning curve can be higher on frameworks. I'm not sure if I agree with that. Honestly, I don't, but it is another thing you have to learn, because if you're new and you're just learning, say, a programming language, maybe then the burden, there can be a burden there because you're learning the language plus the patterns of the framework.
But part of it is also just the size of a framework. Like you're not learning just one tool, you're learning a whole suite of tools. You hit the M, the V, and the C. You got to learn it all, right?
Yep, this is true.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but ideally, if you can get past that and you can read their documentation, then a good framework is going to cut down on boilerplate code, and or at the very least push some of that boilerplate code to the edges of your application and outside of your business logic. Mm-hmm. It's going to hopefully hold your hand a bit and nudge you towards secure practices, towards writing code that's testable and maintainable. I think we'll see some ways that NestJS does that. And it's going to make it easier to get from the hello web to a production application. And what I mean by that is, yes, it probably is if you're just learning quicker to get started with something like Express in Node, which is more of a library. I have heard it called a framework, but it's much closer to a library than a real framework. And if you're struggling to learn JavaScript, that might be an easier place to start, but you're going to get to your toy sort of application very quickly. But then once you start to think about how do I make sure that I'm validating user input properly? How do I authenticate users? How do I generate proper documentation for the API I'm building to present to the people who are going to consume the API? How do I write tests? Once you start doing all those things, it adds up, and you'll end up writing a lot more code than you would if you start out with a good framework, because a good framework is going to know that you're going to need all those things, and it's going to make that path a lot quicker for you.
Cool.
So things I look for in frameworks in general, whether I'm looking for myself or for, you know, an organization I'm working for. Number one, documentation, documentation, documentation. So, you know, you're going to be pulling in this big project. It needs to be well documented. Plus, the quality of the documentation is going to say a lot about the quality of the project overall, I think. So the first thing I'll do if I'm interested in a framework, you know, Google it, Bing it, whatever, take a look, see what the first hits are that come up. And is that first hit that comes up, is it a pretty well laid out web page for that project with easy links to find documentation? Or is it a GitHub page for the project? If it's just a GitHub page, does it at least have like a solid, well thought out README? Or is it just a bunch of forum links with people like complaining and asking questions, right? So, you know, like higher up that tree it is, you know, the better. You ideally want a bit of all three of those, ideally, with preferably that website coming up, you know, high in the search results and being really well laid out. Next thing, you know, you're going to look at testability, and some of the other points here are going to help point towards that. But, you know, I'll take a look at that documentation once I find it and see, are there samples of how to write tests for this? Does it encourage you to write tests? Does it provide anything out of the box that makes writing tests easier? Migrations is a thing I like to think about, because typically, I mean, that may not be true of all frameworks, but we're talking about web API frameworks here. There's a solid chance you're going to be talking to a database and that you're going to need to manage that database. And so if the framework can be the provider of my migration so that I don't have to go elsewhere for that, that's a big plus.
Yeah.
Some other things that I personally like is if it provides a system for dependency injection, and that comes back to that testability, because dependency injection is going to make things much more testable. If you're not aware, dependency injection is basically a pattern wherein you register different classes or entities in your application, such that when you declare a new class, you can basically tell the system that to inject the dependencies, and it will declare all those things for you and provide them. And I'll show some kind of examples of what that looks like later. You can do dependency injection. It's just a pattern. You don't need a framework to do it, but kind of rolling your own dependency injection is it's a pain. It's not something I like to do. So ideally, a framework will provide that, and then that's going to help you make code that is easier to test. Another thing, a thing that NestJS has here, I don't know if this is necessarily a thing to always look for, but it's a pattern that I like, is that Nest has, which is that it makes use of decorators, which can make your code much more declarative, which we'll kind of see what that looks like later too. I think you know, some frameworks like, say, React, if you can call React a framework, have more of a functional API where they're exposing functions that you import and you pass functions to functions. That can also work. You know, some APIs tend to be much more, or some APIs around frameworks tend to be much more object-oriented centric. Those patterns can also work. I think probably the bigger thing to look for here is, well, A, do you like the pattern? And B, does it do it well? Is interacting with this framework going to make your code better or worse? Again, like I mentioned earlier, generators, having CLI tools to create some of that boilerplate code for you so that you don't spend a lot of time editing config files and some of that just configuration code that sits around the edges of your application. And does it help with some of the common problems? Does it do anything to make authentication easier? Does it do anything to help you generate Swagger docs? Does it help with input validation? In the case of JavaScript projects, does it help with your Webpack config? That's a big one. I think that's kind of entry point with any JavaScript framework front end or back end is I don't want to touch Webpack config.
Yeah.
Like, just that should just work out of the box.
Mm-hmm.
Stability of the API, that can be a little hard to judge sometimes, but basically kind of Google around, like when you upgrade from one version to another, does everything break, or is there generally a nice migration path for version upgrades? And then ejection seats. It could be the case that you eventually come to a point where you hit a wall with this framework and you need to abort and get out of there. If so, how hard is that? Is this such a special snowflake that everything you've done is now like completely non-transferable? Or is this something where you could, you know, take some of your code out, stick it within another runtime context and keep going? One thing that'll help you with that in general, regardless of the framework, is thinking in terms of microservice architecture. Because if you're properly dividing up your concerns across applications, then any one application is going to be easier to rework. So even if it does end up being that this is a case of throw it all away, start from scratch, you're rewriting a lot less code if you've gone down the path of microservices. And then finally, I think, although maybe this should be firstly, you want to take a look at the project and the organizational structures around it. You'll get some feel from that from looking at the website. You know, hopefully it'll give you some info about that, but you want to kind of know, is this something that's got major like corporate backer behind it? You know, is it primarily written by Google engineers for their own, you know, internal purposes and then thrown out there as, you know, sort of a marketing write-off? Is it somebody's passion project, you know, maintained by some individuals? Is it managed by like a 501c? You know, what's in it for them? Why are they doing this? How are they monetizing it? You know, maybe there's licensing fees around it if it's not open source. Maybe if it's open source, you know, it's being maintained by a company that also does consulting, or, you know, you kind of want to look at those things to get an idea of how healthy this is. How likely is it that you'll get support? How easy or hard is it going to be to contribute? And just take a, you know, a little look at some of the basic hygiene around the framework. Is it being regularly updated, or are there new versions coming out? You know, is it published to proper package management repositories? You can also use some tools like AuditJS or the built-in NPM audit to scan the project after you create that first skeleton. AuditJS is actually a tool, full disclaimer, that my company does. The team I'm on curates a lot of the data for that. But basically what it's going to do is it will look at your dependency tree and it will tell you if there are known vulnerabilities in those dependencies. If you're starting out clean with a fresh skeleton of a framework, you really want to see those coming back clean and zero. Yeah, like I think you can forgive some, you know, passion projects or maybe internal projects. Like it can be hard to stay totally on top of all those things. But if you're pulling this thing in as a framework, there's a high bar there that you've set for yourself by doing that. And this is going to be the base on what you're going to build. So you really don't want anything that comes down dirty off the bat. And then, you know, the popularity component, how many people are downloading this thing. So let's look a gift horse in the mouth here, and let's take a look at NestJS. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I haven't really, well, I've shown some various shots from their website. Their website, I will say right off the bat, is beautiful, and the documentation seems to be great. They have this support us section down here, and it explains, among other things, that it's an MIT licensed project, which is great because it's open source, but it's very permissive license, so it's very corporate friendly. The only really requirement that's sticking you with is that if you do decide to fork and modify or copy, paste, and maintain some of this code on your own, you're going to have to stick a notice about the fact that you acquired this from this MIT project. with that license, but you're not carrying that license forward. You're not stuck with that. You just have to basically call out where you got this from. And really, you shouldn't be doing that with a framework anyways. If you are doing that, something's gone horribly wrong. You should be pulling the framework down from where it comes from, using it without modification. If you do want to modify it, you should be doing that upstream, meaning like going to the project, talking to them, creating a pull request against that project to get whatever feature or bug fix in you want. That way it can help everybody, but also from purely selfish reasons, that way you're not now forking and maintaining the framework, which is a terrible idea because at that point, you've lost all advantages of a framework. You've now in-housed all that work and all that responsibility. So license, cool. You see right there on the NPM page, you can see the link to nestjs.com. So that right there is a good sign. I know they have an actual homepage. You go there, it looks good. 316,000 weekly downloads right now. It's a big number, but maybe not so big. Let's get some context around that. Oh, I feel like some slide is out of order. Here we go. So, so yeah, giving a little bit of context on that. It is pretty tiny compared to something like, say, React, which is at 7.6 million weekly downloads right now. But it's not so far off of a project like SQLize, which I'll talk about a bit later, but that is what I consider to be a fairly popular library for, it's basically an ORM for dealing with talking to SQL backends in Node projects. So it's not too far out of that ballpark. And if you look, I found this cool site called NPM Stat that lets you kind of look a little farther back on some of these projects. And if you look at the weekly downloads for something like Vue, which is, a very popular community supported front-end framework, you can see that going back to, say, in 2018, it too was down in a similar range of weekly downloads. So if you're someone that would have used Vue in 2018, or if you're someone that uses SQLize, then this is, maybe in that ballpark in terms of the amount of usage it's getting. So come back here again. Another thing worth checking out here, how old is the project? How long has it been running for? In this case, I just checked out the repo and found the first commit, which was around 4 years ago. So it's not really old enough to drive, but by Node standards, I don't know. I think that means the HR departments out there are going to want at least 6+ years of experience using it before they'll hire you.
Yeah.
So another cool thing I noticed, like I took a look at the GitHub page at the issues being registered, and I noticed this, several questions, including this one. It had just been posted an hour ago as a new issue. And you'll see the response was almost immediate. Now, in this case, the response was essentially, this isn't really the right place for this question, go here. That was the correct response because they weren't really filing a bug. They were kind of asking for help. But they were pretty curious about that, and they responded really quickly. And that just, at a quick glance, that looked to be a norm. So that's a very good thing to see that, that's active, that people are looking out and responding to things. What you don't want to see is issues that have just sat there with a lot of discussion from the community and no responses from the project. And yeah, that's a bad thing. Oh yeah, this is the popularity contest. The cool kids smoke and drink beer. Apparently. So let's dive in a bit then. I think we've learned as much as we can from browsing their websites. So how do you create a new project? Well, they have a generator, which, as I mentioned, which is great. So you can npm install the Nest CLI. You'll also notice there that it is behind a NestJS namespace or scope, I believe, as they call them in npm. That means that the project has registered this actual sort of namespace, and that's nice when projects do that because that lets you know when you're installing dependencies around that ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Do they come from this organization, or do they come from, you know, some third party? Once you've installed the CLI, it's just nest new infinite API. And in this case, infinite API is the name of my project here, as I'm kind of testing this out against the Infinite Industries API. And that's what I mean by a generator there. You should be able to do that, and then you should get your project. And as I mentioned earlier, it's good to trust, but we should also verify. So here I'm running the aforementioned audit.js, as well as the NPM audit here against this. And both of them are coming back clean with 0 vulnerabilities. So that's what we want to see there. So now, taking a look here, what did it create for us? Well, there's some standard kind of stuff that every node project is going to have: package JSON, lock, etc. Kind of interesting bits here, though, are we have these app controller, app module, app service, an app controller spec. So coming back to that test thing, does it try to suggest writing tests? Yeah, not so subtly. It automatically creates a first test here, which is good. And that's, you know, you'll also notice, if you're familiar with Angular 2, very, 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 very Angular derived. This is the same pattern you'll see in Angular, pretty much almost the same file names for the skeleton app it creates. And so taking a look at what these do, I'll start over here with the controller, because the controller, so controller is a common name you'll see used throughout a lot of web frameworks, often used to denote sort of the entry point into the API. So this is where you will define like your different endpoints that people are going to hit to trigger things to happen. So in this case, they've defined here, and you can see, you know, I mentioned the declarative syntax. So this @get here, for example, is a TypeScript decorator. And what this is doing is saying to the framework that this function here is going to be an endpoint. You should wire this up and expose it as such. In this case, I'm like, this controller and this get decorator both have no parameters. That means that these are basically going to be the default endpoint. So this is what's going to happen if you hit / on this application, if you're going to the root. And mentioned dependency injection. You can see that at play here as well. You'll notice this constructor is empty. All I'm doing here is declaring a private read-only app service and applying a type to it. Because the framework knows how to inject dependencies, and because it knows via TypeScript that this is an app service, it is automatically going to instantiate for me. And it's going to also, and this is more, I think, a TypeScript thing than the framework, but having this private here inside of the constructor is also saying, go ahead and make this thing a private instance variable and assign it. That just saves me from declaring the variable again up here and then setting it in the constructor, which is kind of the standard way of doing this. It's a nice little bit of syntactic sugar. So up here you see our app service. You see again, decorator, we're saying that this is injectable. So this is saying that this is something that you will see injected in other places. And we have a single method here. It's just returning the string hello world. Over here, kind of at the edges of the application, you see some of that boilerplate that's needed to make the framework work and make the dependency injection work. So you'll see our controllers. We need to register our controllers by putting them in this controllers array. So as we add more controllers, we'll put them in here. And providers here, you see the app service is a provider. By that being in there, that's going to help the dependency injection system know to inject that here. All this language is borrowed from Angular 2, but also, like I said, not too different from what you see in other dependency injection systems and other web frameworks and such. Not much to see in the main.ts. This is the entry point to our application, but really all we're doing here is initializing the framework and giving it our module, which is kind of our configuration. And from there, the framework is going to do all the necessary things to call our code at the right points in time.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty clean and pretty nice so far. So let's move on then and get down to work at this point. Like, the best thing you can do to evaluate a framework like this is to try something a little bit closer to real world. Mm-hmm. So one of the endpoints that we have in our Infinite Industries API is we have ways to get lists of the venues in the area and to create new venues so that we can, say where an event is taking place if we weren't living in COVID times where everything exists in the ether anyway. So a little bit of this here isn't actually strictly necessary for this bit, but we'll come back to it. So I mentioned, I think earlier, Sequelize, and Sequelize is an ORM. This framework, it can actually use kind of two different ORMs out of the box, but our existing project uses Sequelize, and I'm a fan of it. So their documentation does in fact claim that this integrates fairly tightly with Sequelize, so that seemed great. So that's the route I'm going. I won't actually really leverage Sequelize just yet. We'll come back to it, but I wanted to set up the models and stuff with some of the Sequelize decorators and things here. So what I'm gonna do here is go ahead at this point, you install the NestJS Sequelize. So you can see that bit is coming from the NestJS project here. So that's a bit of glue code around Sequelize itself. Now, a bit of a gotcha here, you'll notice I am specifying a specific version of Sequelize. One thing I did run into was when I first followed their docs and installed this, it installed Sequelize 6.x, which is current, but Sequelize TypeScript here, which is another third-party dependency that they're relying on here to make all this magic work, doesn't yet work with 6.x, so you will get bizarre cryptic errors. So stick with 5 for now. I'm hoping that they'll fix that soon. And then you have to, Sequelize is somewhat database agnostic. So you install the drivers for the particular flavor of SQL you're going to use. So the second line here is installing the necessary drivers for Postgres. And then, finally, there is a build time dependency here. So you need to install the types for Sequelize, which are going to give us the proper type declarations for TypeScript to understand some of this. And then you can kind of see over here that this section is going to involve like we're going to create basically 4 files to get to this point where we can return a list of venues. And what does that look like then? So you don't necessarily have to create your own module for this, but this is a pattern that's strongly encouraged in the documentation for NestJS, that basically each of your sort of your entities that you're going to have routes around, that you wrap those in their own what they call a module, which is pretty much the same concept as they have in Angular around modules. So what that looks like here is we created, as you saw back here, is a directory for venues, and inside that directory, we're going to have a model, we're going to have a controller, we're going to have a service, and we're going to have a module to expose what we need to from that module. So right here, you can see our controller. It looks a lot like the Hello World controller. We have a get path. You will notice, though, up here in the controller here, I passed this string venues. That means this is going to be exposed at /venues. And this is going to be the get HTTP verb under venues. And we're going to return a promise that is of type venue array. And again, we're injecting a service here. and we're just returning from the service find all, which is itself returning a promise of type venue array. One of the nice things about having this be in TypeScript versus just raw ECMAScript is that if this didn't return a promise of type venue array, my IDE would be yelling at me and the transpiler would be yelling at me.
Mm-hmm.
So over here you can see this is the DTO we defined here for returning the data from the database. So I'm making use here, this is the SQLized TypeScript part of this, but again, it's following this declarative pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a class here, venue, and I'm telling it that this class is backed by a table called venues, and all these attributes in the class are backed by columns in the database.
Uh-huh.
And over here, my service, now, right now, as I mentioned, we haven't quite done everything we need to wire up the SQLize. So for right now, what I'm going to do is this get all, we're going to fake it. We're just going to return a kind of bogus venue that we make up and return a result promise with an array of one venue.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll kind of stop there for now with that part. And then we'll do one more thing though, to kind of see if we can check this off the box and what it looks like. And also it's going to help us now start to test this code.
Sure.
So we'll skip ahead to the Swagger documentation part of this that I mentioned. I'm a big fan of Swagger documents if you're going to have any kind of public API.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see what those look like here in a minute. There's kind of a standard format for them. But I don't want to spend a ton of time and effort creating them. And there are lots of frameworks out there to help you create them and make it very easy. Express is not one of those. And there is some tools you can build onto it that will generate the Swagger docs for you. But what we'll see here is what that looks like is what we have here on the right. Mm-hmm. And this is a YAML file for a model called user. Mm-hmm. It doesn't look terrible, right? Like YAML's not ugly, and especially when you have syntax highlighting. Mm-hmm. But now imagine though, this isn't the code defining user. This is just the YAML. Right. Notice how this is basically about everything that you would have in the class to define user. Right. And in fact, if you're not using TypeScript, when you define that user, if you're in ECMAScript, you're going to have to tell the ORM what types to use for deserialization and such as well. So your ORM's probably going to provide you with some sort of constants to pass it to tell that it's a string. So you're going to end up, even though you're in this supposedly non-statically typed language, you're going to end up providing all this type information. You're going to provide it twice in two different files. And anytime you update this user class, you're going to have to remember that there's a YAML file, go back, find it, modify it. Whereas if we look over here, this compared to this looks bigger at a glance, but what you're seeing here is the code and the Swagger docs all generated from one place. And the only thing I've changed here from our previous version of this is I've added this API property. And that's not even strictly necessary, but what this is giving us is by providing this example to the API property, you'll see it later, is it's going to, in the Swagger doc, kind of generate what a sample venue might look like, so that the user will have an idea of what this looks like when it's returned, or what it might look like if they want to pass it to create a venue. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, everything else that we need to know is being derived from the TypeScript typing. And if I go in here and delete or add a property, it's very obvious that I need to also change that. And I guess worth noting there that there's the dependency that I install here, and the Swagger UI Express, which is third party, is what you would use if you were going to do this with say Express without the framework. It's just then you're going to have to provide it with all these YAML files and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So here we go. Here is what a Swagger doc looks like. It's telling us what our endpoints are right now and how we can use them. We can see here it's got a example of a venue there.
Mm-hmm.
And you can actually click try it out and click execute, and it's going to make the curl request for us. And you can see there it's returned a venue for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's the default endpoint that it built, and it's going to just return a string if we execute it. So it's pretty nice there. And that way you can maintain that documentation easily. And it's also worth noting here, this is just exposed where our API lives at /API. So we have our server running on localhost 3000. I would go to /venues to get the venues. Here I just go to /API to get these Swagger docs. So now we'll come back to the SQLized, just so that you can see there's no tricks up my sleeve. And we'll finish that out. And there's not a lot left to do here. This is the service now returning data from an actual database. So we're again making use of the dependency injection, but we're using a special injector here called inject model, which is just kind of telling the framework that this is a special case. This is like a SQLized model. And then SQLized models all expose methods for database operations on that entity. So in this case, what we want is just find all. And they all return a promise of that type of model. So we don't have to do much there. I went ahead and added a create as well. I am doing one thing here in the create, which is setting the ID on this entity. I don't actually really recommend that. We should probably let SQLized do that, but due to some legacy with the database I was basing this off of and some what have yous, that was a quicker, easier way to get this working.
Sure.
But just calling that out, don't necessarily imitate that bit. And there is a little bit of boilerplate to that, like a little bit of final setup here around SQLized. So this is coming back to our app module. We need to pull in a SQLized module, which will tell the framework about SQLized and tell SQLized kind of about our configuration. So all I'm doing here is I'm using .env, which is a pretty standard library for Node applications to read environment variables. I'm pulling that in just so that I can pass it most of my database config through environment variables. This is a good habit to get into because A, you don't want to accidentally check in your username and password to source control, and B, this really should vary depending on each instance of the service. So if you're running it in production, if you're running it in staging, or if you're running it on any random person developer's dev box, these are going to be different. But yeah, just a bit of config there. And you need to make one little change over at our venues module as well, which is to just tell it that that module makes use of the venue model there.
Okay.
And from there, that should be up and running, but we're going to do one more thing before we cut to the demo because we need a database to run it against.
Sure.
And we also need to see, does this help us with migrations? The answer is migrations provided, sort of. So it does not really do much to help us with migrations, the framework itself, but SQLized does. Like SQLized provides a migration framework, and because it integrates tightly with SQLized, you have access to the SQLized migration capabilities. So basically, their recommendation is use that, or if you were to go with the other ORM they offer, Typeorm, same difference. So it's not the end of the world. I do consider this a bit of a ding. What you'll see here to get this up and running is you install the SQLized CLI. So, and then you can generate new migrations through SQLized. So we're creating 2 migrations here, and this is our first one here, which is just creating some necessary extensions on Postgres. I won't go into detail why we need to do that. It's a standard Postgres thing. But the thing I will point out here is this is standard ECMAScript. It is not TypeScript. That's one of the downsides of the fact that it's not giving us any kind of wrappers here. We don't have the decorators. We're just writing nasty old-fashioned JavaScript for that part of our application. So our migrations will be nasty old JavaScript. But hey, that's the devil we know.
Sure.
It's not the end of the world, and especially from the context of the project I'm evaluating this for, where we already have a bunch of migrations written against SQLize, means it's just a copy-paste. This over here is just what the migration looks like to create the table. So it is worth mentioning that about SQLize. So SQLize does try to help you a bit. So, you know, in this case, you can use SQLize to just pass it straight up SQL in strings to do your migrations, but also it has some magic to try to help you do some of that too through functional calls. So that's not the end of the world. You can just look at the SQLize docs. It is also a pretty good framework. So here we go. Does it work? So right there, I'm using Docker to create an empty Postgres database. And now I'm going to run the SQLize migrate command. And we should see here that, yep, it ran my 2 migrations. And if we go here and take a look at the database and see what's in there, we should have a database here called Infinite API. Font's a little small there, sorry. But inside there, you'll see we have 2 tables, a venues table like we expect to see. And it seems to look all correct. There's also a SQLize meta table there that is basically just where the migration framework stores its magic. So it's gonna tell you which migrations have been run so that it doesn't reapply migrations it's already done and so forth. So here we go, coming back to the Swagger docs, we've now got a create endpoint. If we execute, we see that we're getting back an empty list because there's nothing in our database. If we go down and take a look at our post endpoint, we have a nice sample there. We can try it out. It defaults to our sample. We can execute that post. It returned the model with the ID filled in. And we can now come back here and we can execute again, and we get back a list with our newly created venue in it.
Nice.
Yeah. So all fairly clean. So what's the report card on NestJS? Well, the good out of the box TypeScript experience is great. You know, I mentioned that whole thing about does it have a out of the box Webpack config, like this handles like the TS config, the Webpack config, all that transpilation for you. And that's really nice in Node. I haven't really, you see that with front-end frameworks, but I hadn't really experienced that in Node. I've set it up myself before, and I always kind of question if I should be doing that. I wanted to use TypeScript in Node, but I really didn't like taking on the management of that config and generating the source maps and stuff.
Right.
It feels like this is doing that for me and doing it fairly well. The dependency injection definitely seems to make life simpler and does its job of pushing the boilerplate code out to the edges. As I mentioned earlier, that should make things more testable because when you create your test, what you can do is you can pass mocks in for the dependencies. Basically what you're doing there, I'll circle back to that a little bit. Why dependency injection makes things more testable is that all your edges, like sort of all the stuff that class is not itself doing, is passed into the constructor. And because you have that dependency injection system in your actual production code, like you don't have to worry about the fact that your constructor now suddenly takes like 12 things passed to it. But at the same time, when you're writing tests, you can optionally pass
fakes,
something different to it. You can pass fakes, and then that allows you to isolate what you're testing and to really control the responses from those things. So that's great. The decorators keep things dry, and really worked out well with the Swagger documentation, which is one thing I was really looking for. The simple integration with SQLize seems to work particularly well, and should make migrating our existing code base over fairly easy. The project has a great website, lots of detailed, well put together docs. The bad, I did hit a few snags. Like I mentioned earlier, there was the issue with the not so well documented SQL TypeScript to SQLize version mismatches.
Right.
There's some decorators that I ran into that seem to be order specific, like that column decorator. If you're putting a couple decorators in your entity there and you get them in the wrong order, that can cause some weird bugs. It really wasn't too bad because the error message was explicit enough that I realized right away, oh, maybe I should try this column in a different order. There's also, I didn't really touch on it, but I made use earlier back there of an header decorator, which lets you control additional things that can be returned in the header on the response. That appears to be right now only functioning at the level of the endpoint. I can't stick that, say, on the controller and make it apply to all endpoints in a module. So that could be a pain. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that you could actually create that effect because there's also a system that's similar to like express pipes. So there's some other ways you could get around that and essentially set that at a module level, but it's not quite as declarative as I would like.
Sure.
There's some discussion on a forum that may be something that they implement, or they were at least very open to somebody implementing it and giving them a PR.
So other frameworks do it with something called a middleware. I don't know if.
Yes, middleware is the word I was looking for when I said pipe. So
Sure.
So they do a lot of stuff that makes, so middleware is, the very common pattern in Express. There is ways to do middleware, though they set it up such that you don't necessarily need to use middleware for a lot of things.
Right.
But to solve this case here, you could definitely do that.
Sure. The thing to remember with middleware is it runs on everything. So,
yeah.
If you put code in there, it's going to run every single time.
Well, you can, yeah. Well, you can do kind of a middleware thing. There's also a way to do kind of, I think, like middleware per controller. There's some options there. So there's some ways you could get what you want there. And, I didn't really go over auth in this, but I did take a look at auth and it was pretty good. And the middleware kind of made me think of that because normally in Express, you would implement your auth, generally as middleware. They have kind of a special guard decorator for this that under the hood might be doing something similar, but abstracted a bit. And I thought it was fairly nice. But it wasn't so unique that I couldn't basically just copy paste most of my existing code from the way I was authenticating my other application, but in the right spot here. Other thing, well, like I said, I've already mentioned the migration thing, not the end of the world. And the project's somewhat young, right? 4 years old. At the same time, it's, full of promise. And they seem to be taking feature requests seriously and stuff. So who knows where it can go from here. It's community supported, which is a double-edged sword. I put that under meh, not because it's a bad thing, but because I don't know if it's a good or a bad thing. It kind of depends on the quality of the community, the passion. It might also come down to, just because it's community supported too doesn't mean no one is getting paid. Like it could mean that it's people doing this in their spare time, not getting paid, which can be fine, but it can be problematic, right? Because that means that maybe they don't have as much time to dedicate to it because they probably have a day job, or it means they're dedicating a lot of time to it and burning the candle at both ends, so they might burn out. I didn't delve too deeply into this though, because it could also be very community supported, but paying one or two people's salaries, right? Like they could have a monetization scheme around this. They might be offering services. They might be getting a boatload of donations. I don't really know, but it's something to consider. It's not like it has a major corporate backer behind it.
Okay. Yeah, I see it's that French pharmaceutical Sanofi.
Steve, can you say that again? We didn't hear you.
Is it Sanofi, the French pharmaceutical company?
I almost caught that. You're breaking up some. I heard something about a French pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, I think it's Sanofi. I'm sorry I'm breaking up. It must be a problem with my tablet.
Maybe you can type it in the chat. I think there should be a, I don't know if I can actually, there should be a chat somewhere.
There is.
Usually it's like just off to the side. I don't actually see it in the normal Zoom spot. Maybe it's because, oh, maybe I don't have. Do you see the chat, Ron?
I do see the chat. Go ahead and type in there, and I opened it up in a separate window before I opened the video screen.
Okay, great. So yeah, maybe if he can type it, you can tell me what he is asking here. Oh wait, this might be where my controls are.
Sanofi is the sponsor.
Uh-huh.
I guess Sanofi is a French drug company. Is that what you said, Steve?
I saw like their site listed several sponsors.
Yeah.
Sanofi was the first one listed. They also listed Valor Software here, which I'm somewhat familiar with. They make some Angular libraries. They're pretty popular, like third-party Angular stuff. I'm trying to think. I want to say they're maybe the ones behind NGX Bootstrap, which is a Bootstrap wrapper for Angular.
Oh, okay.
I don't know to what extent, like, principal sponsor, what that means, if to what extent that means they actually write code versus they give some money versus they
cut the biggest check.
yeah, exactly. So I don't know.
Sanofi is a French pharma company that is a very large company. So
yeah,
wouldn't surprise me if they're using it for enterprise purposes and their dev teams are, building.
Yep.
It also means though that they're adding to it when it suits them and they have a particular business need, not necessarily when the community is adding to it. But it's good to see lots of different level sponsorships and lots of people, using the tool. 600,000 downloads a week is pretty solid. I mean, it's nothing to say.
Well, 316,000, but yeah.
I was rounding.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and in fact, kind of coming back to that, the final takeaway there is I think I'm not going to give it a like 1 through 10 or, A, B, C, D score, but I will give it a binary score, which is will I keep using it? And the answer is a resounding yes. I definitely plan to continue down that path of trying to port over the Infinite API.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't say for sure that we'll land on it, but it's looking very promising. So far, I've ported over like some significant portions of it, including some of the things that I thought might give us problems, and they went very smoothly.
Nice.
So
is that because you were already using the SQLize stuff anyway in the previous code? So
yeah, I mean, that probably helps a lot. Like if you weren't using SQLize or Typeform, I suppose it might be a bigger effort.
Mm-hmm.
But because we're already using that, then a lot of the service layer code doesn't change much. And where it does change, it's mostly for the better. There's some stuff there that I can't wait to get rid of.
Excellent.
So yeah.
Wait, tell me, how did you discover this thing? When did you
actually? I don't know if he's on here, but Matthew Gitcomb, who comes to this quite a lot, actually told me about it.
Cool.
He said when he first saw it, he was going to send it to me as kind of a joke because I like to, like, kind of half jokingly, but also kind of seriously, like, try to rewrite all JavaScript code in TypeScript now. And so he saw, NodeJS TypeScript framework. Chris will love this. And I said at first he thought it was kind of sarcastic, and then he started reading the docs, and he was like, "Oh no, I think Chris will really like this."
Even better.
Yeah.
So is this the kind of thing where you think you could roll it out one corner at a time with your API, or do you think it's better to just redo the whole damn thing?
Well, if I was gonna do that, if I had a more complicated API, probably like you could like segment off parts, like you could have, host one API behind one set of endpoints from one API, process, and another set of endpoints from another, or, however you want to deal with that split. And you could run both APIs and just kind of migrate the client over to using the new one.
Mhm.
The infinite API isn't that complicated or big though. So I think it's just a rewrite and hard cut.
Nice. How long do you think that's going to take? Always hard to say, right?
Yeah, very hard to say. If this was actually my day job and I was doing it 8 hours a day, the API is small enough that, well, I want to say a week, but probably also if it was my day job, I'd say like 2 or 3 weeks to be cautious. The old Starfleet engineers policy of never, always add some time when you tell the captain how long it'll take.
Exactly, because he's going to tell you less.
Yeah, and there's going to be something you don't expect. There's always something you don't expect. So, weeks, not months, though.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Now, given that this is a thing that I work on just on weekends and stuff, it might be slower than that because you just only have so much time, and the less consistently you work on something like this, the more time there is relearning the stuff that you've learned last time and forgotten and all that good stuff.
This is a server side like development tool for server apps, basically, right?
Yes, yeah. It's inspired by Angular, which is a front end framework, but this is for developing your server side business logic.
Looks pretty cool. I really appreciate you putting together the presentation.
Thank you.
Awesome. I'm glad you shared this with us. It's nice nice to see the needle moving on Node.
Yeah, I think Node's needed something like this for a while, because to me, like Express is nice, but it's not a complete solution. It's kind of a build your own solution, and I don't know. Like I said, I don't want to knock it. It's very cool at what it does, but it's kind of always been a little strange to me that we don't have more of a proper framework.
Thanks again, Chris, for that very interesting presentation. This has been the Kentucky JavaScript User Group. Looking forward to seeing you next time.